Hello, we're going to continue on with talking about flowers. A lot of times people look forward to this lab because it's kind of fun, tearing apart flowers, looking at inside of them. Anyways, there's a lot of diversity in flowers, so I'm going to try to cover some of the ways in which in horticulture we sort of separate out all the plants into different types of families and species, and a lot of it has to do with looking at flower structure and leaf structure and things like that. So today we're talking about flowers and the different ways to describe them, what their parts are, and all that kind of stuff. So there are, hundreds of thousands of species out there, and they all have their own unique way of presenting themselves to pollinators, and that diversity is really important for the health of the plants. So what we're looking at here is the main objective, obviously, if, for a flower is to produce offspring, right? So a plant grows, it wants to have more young plants to take over the world, and so it tries to produce as much seed as possible. So plants have adapted to attract pollinators and also have adapted to ensure that they try to receive another plant's pollen before they receive their own. Um, so like I said, attracting insects to bring pollen from other plants, that's a strategy. Um, Even just wind pollinated plants will delay their development, right? So that the male part from their own flower doesn't mature till later, so that there's a chance they might catch pollen from another particular plant. And if that doesn't happen, then their own male part will mature and they will fertilize and hope for another day, right? Um, And plants are also able to recognize their own pollen, so they can decide if they want to let it germinate or not. The picture here is passion flower. It's kind of it's always nice to show lots of pretty flowers, right? But the idea behind what these flowers are doing is that they are a really good example of where the flower is delaying the development of the male part, hoping to fertilize with another flower. And the the way it works is the female part will present itself to the air and to pollinators, and should no one arrive, then as it sort of finally matures, it curls down and then touches the anthers to pick up pollen. So it's sort of a delayed developmental stage just to hold off on self-pollination. So let's look at some of the basics before we get into the real nitty-gritty of it. So introduction to flower anatomy, we we know that plants have pollen, and that pollen resides in the anther, right? Sits there, lots of different flowers. This is a nice little diagram that helps us to sort of just keep it all organized in our minds. And of course, the idea is that that pollen is supposed to land on the female part, in this case, the stigma. So in this particular diagram, that's where it's headed. And of course, at that point, then pollen germinates and it has to travel down through this structure called the style into the ovary, typically down around to the bottom where then it fertilizes eggs, zygotes. Anyways, so you'll learn more about fertilization in another lesson, so I don't want to get into it too much. But um, the key structure here is collectively the male is called the stamen, which comprises the anther, and then the filament, some sort of a stalk that suspends it. So we call that the filament. On the female side, the entire structure is called the pistil, and it is always the stigma that receives the pollen. And then there is a style, depending on the species, that can be a very short distance, almost non-existent. And then there's the ovary, where the zygotes reside, waiting to be fertilized. You're going to have to find a way to remember this stigma style ovary. I'm sure that there's interesting tricks out there, but just keep saying stigma style ovary, in that sort of sequence. You'll keep it in order. Um, the fact that there's six here doesn't really matter, but in this case, we have a bunch of stamens. So there's a filament and an anther collectively. And there's the filament, there's the anthers, 6 of them in total in this particular lily, the male parts. And looking at a tulip, there's the anther and a short filament down below, pretty visible in a tulip. Looking at a hibiscus, the stamens actually come off the style. So here we have the stigma at the top where the pollen is received, and then there's this style that goes down to the base where the ovary is. And as an adaptation here, the stamens actually are fused to the style. So lots and lots of variations in flowers. Looking at this lotus, there's the stamens surrounding the pistil. So beautiful flowers. Could look at these all day. The cactus, so the same thing. There's a pistil in the middle and lots of stamen around the exterior. And these are often structured in such a way that pollinators, there's a good chance the pollinators will attract to the will pick up pollen and move into the pistil and deposit pollen on the stigma. Most flowers at the base have some sort of nectary. We've discussed that before. That is an attractant to the pollinators. So deep down in the flower, so the insects dig down trying to get to the nectary and pick up the pollen, and in the process help carry that pollen away or bring pollen to that plant. There's just another variation in this little crocus has got a fused with pistil and stamen, similar to the hibiscus, where the stamen are fused to the style. So, quick review. What is the arrow pointing at? That's the male part, the anther. What's it pointing at? That's that little filament that holds the anther up. What is this pointing at? So remember, stigma style ovary, stigma style ovary. So it's stigma at the top, style, and then ovary. So that's the style. And that is the stigma. Anyways, there's a summary picture for that. Now, looking at flowers, there's a fancy horticultural word here, whorl. It's, pronounce it as you like. A whorl, it's a spiral of, or a circular pattern of structures. And so in flowers, we refer to the calyx is made up of something called sepals, and the corolla is made up of structures called petals, which you're familiar with. And then, of course, the stamen, which we've talked about, they form a circular structure or whorl. And then the pistil is also a whorl. In this case, it's a tight sort of singular part, but it's also in circular. When we talk about fruit next week, it'll probably make a little more sense. If you think of an apple and you cut the apple, instead of vertically, cut it horizontally through the middle, you'll see that there's a whorl in the center, and the ovaries form different sections radially around the center as well. Um, so looking at petals, collectively we call that whorl the corolla. And sepals, collectively we call that whorl the calyx. And of interest, another key part of the flower is called the receptacle. Think of it as just like a receptacle in your house. You plug things in. And so the receptacle is where the petals and sepals and the ovaries and the filaments plug into to sort of hold the whole flower together. When you're doing your dissections, you're going to be pulling off components from the receptacle. As a memory aid for remembering the difference between corolla and calyx, think of Corolla as a Toyota Corolla, like a car. They come in all kinds of colors. And so that might help you remember that the Corolla is for petals. And then collectively, if we look at the corolla and the calyx together as a package deal, that's called a perianth. That's the perianth. Lastly, these little stems, which we'll talk about at the end of this class when we talk about the different types of flower structures, it's referred to as the peduncle or the pedicel. I think probably just choose whichever word you think is more fun. And then there's again, everything put together in one slide. So looking at petals, typically the colorful part of the plant, I think we know that. I got a picture here that is actually showing these black-eyed Susans under UV light. So over here is under UV. A lot of pollinators, especially bees, look at things in the UV spectrum, and flowers look very different under UV light. And the pigments are often meant to orient the pollinator to where the center of the flower is, so they know where to go. It's like landing strip lights or something like that, right? So just to guide the pollinators in. Talking about sepals, the classic is a rose. You know, you look at a rose, but there's these look like leaves, but they're actually sepals that wrap around the bud and protect the bud before it has opened, right? And as the bud starts to swell and enlarge, the sweet sepals will peel back, revealing the corolla. And here's again some more sepals. So they protect the bud. Lots of different examples of sepals. Sometimes they're fused. So zooming in over here, you can see the sepals form sort of a tube like a trumpet, and the flower comes out of that. So this salvia, you can see the flower has emerged out of this sort of fused sepal tube. But again, the whole purpose of the sepals are just to protect the flower until it's time for it to open. So up here at the top, you can see some of the buds are tight, and they're just starting to crack open, and here they've emerged more. So the sepals are serving their purpose of protecting the bud while it's developing in the center. Sometimes it's confusing looking at petals and sepals. Like on this trillium, it's really pretty straightforward. We've got white petals and we've got a green sepal, right? No problem. But if you look at this trout lily, these things all look the same. They're all yellow, you know, where's the sepals? And the reality is that the sepals are in alternate positions and they look just like petals. But when the bud is closed, the sepals are on the exterior. That's how we know that they are in fact sepals. So collectively, the petals are called, so remember my trick, Toyota Corollas come in different colors. Corolla. Collectively, the corolla and calyx together are referred to as the perianth. Study slide, not going to spend time on it. Another angle on sepals and petals that look very similar is a phrase called tepals. It just must just be hilarious sitting in these times with these meetings where people come up with these words. But anyways, tepal. So the classic example here is daylilies. You know, you can see the sepals, which are these outer colored tissues, would envelop the bud when it hasn't opened. So over here, see how the bud is closed? That is tepals. So, and then when they open, there's your actual petals. So tepals, there you go. Looking at calyx, this datura shows a really good example of a fused calyx. So that's where the sepals have formed a singular tube where the flower emerges from. And then, of course, the corolla would be the fused petals. Another really good example of fused petals would be a petunia, right? So you can actually see the lines along which the petals have fused to form the corolla. So the term perianth, again, refers to both the calyx and the corolla, and it can be fused. Oftentimes when it's fused, we refer to it as a perianth, but technically you can refer to it as a perianth in any context, like in this lily as well. So let's talk about the different types of flowers as they relate to um, whether all their structures are present. So we'll start with the term complete flowers. So a complete flower has all the whorls present. That means it has stamen, pistils, calyx, and corolla. It's a complete flower. Everything is there. That's an easy one to remember because it's complete, right? You know, roses, tomatoes, tulips, anything in the Rosaceae family. Incomplete flowers are a flower that is lacking any one whorl. So things get a little logistically challenged as we go through this section here. So just watch the language and the words, and that will help you remember. So complete has everything, and incomplete is missing something. It doesn't matter what, it just has to be missing one of the whorls. So it could be missing a stamen, it could be missing pistils, it could be missing a calyx, or it could be missing a corolla. Any one of them, right? So in this case, grasses, elm trees, oaks. This picture is of grass flowers. And in this case, we're just looking at anthers that are suspended in the air. Um, there are no petals. Grasses are not interested in attracting pollinators. They're wind pollinated. So they're missing a corolla. Um, Another example of an incomplete flower might be a flower that has only one gender part. And this begonia just happens to have the male part, stamens. There's no ovary, so it's incomplete. So we have complete where it has all the whorls, and we have incomplete where it's missing one of the whorls. This happens to be a gender, but it doesn't have to be. Like the grass is missing the corolla. So in this case, we call this a staminate flower because of the gender. Begonias are a good example of plants that have both male and female. So that's a staminate flower, and if it was a female, it would be a carpellate flower. So only female parts. Um, Now, I introduced you to the male and female flower, but there's a term that goes with that. So before we had complete flowers that have all the whorls, and then we had incomplete flowers that are missing any one whorl. And now, if we refer just to gender, so only looking at gender, we have both perfect and imperfect. So a perfect flower has both genders present, both male and female, both stamens and pistil, on the same floral structure, right? And they don't have to have a calyx or corolla. They just have to have both genders, where an imperfect flower is missing one or the other gender. So in this case, a corn tassel at the top of the corn plant is a imperfect flower that is both also staminate because it is a male flower. And there is no calyx or corolla. Uh, Again, begonias, they can be only male or female, so they are imperfect. Now, going through these questions might help sort some of the confusion you might have right now. So a flower that has stamens and a pistil, but no corolla or calyx. So let's just dissect the question, right? Is it complete? So complete means it has everything present. Well, no, it's missing the corolla and the calyx. So we know it's incomplete. Does it have both male and female parts? So let's see. The question says it has stamens and a pistil, so it has both. So it is incomplete and perfect. Okay, perfect because it has both genders. Incomplete because it's missing both the corolla and the calyx. This next question, a flower that has a pistil and a corolla but no stamens. Okay, so first of all, is it complete? Is it missing anything? Well, it's missing stamens, so it's incomplete. Now, does it have both genders or does it have one? We know it's got a pistil, but it's missing stamens. So it's incomplete and imperfect. Okay? Incomplete and imperfect. Now, looking at plants that have different gender flowers, there's a couple of terms we need to come to grips with. One is monoecious plants, and the other is dioecious plants. So monoecious plants have both male and female flowers on the same plant. Now, to help you remember this, just remember that the word mono means one. So mono means one. That means that only one plant is needed because both genders are on the plant. Okay? Where dioecious means di means two plants are required. So you know that there's a separate male and a separate female plant. So monoecious, both gender flowers are on the same plant, right? But they're typically separate. They're separated. So these would be imperfect. So corn, The tassels at the top is where the staminate flowers are. And then at the bottom, we have the pistillate flowers, which are these, oh, I'm drawing a blank. Silks. That's what it is, silks. Anyways, so what the corn plant typically tries to do is it delays the maturing of the staminate flowers so that potentially pollen can land on the silks and cross-pollinate the plant. And after a certain period of time, if that pollination hasn't happened, then the plant will mature its own staminate flowers. The pollen falls down and lands on the silks. Now, if you've ever opened an ear of corn, you'll notice that these silks, it's just full of strings inside, right? So every single silk ends at a corn kernel because each kernel is an ovary, right? So then however many kernels there are is how much minimum pollen you need to pollinate that corn cob. So corn, by the way, the pollen is very heavy, so it's really tricky to cross-pollinate. You need a lot of wind. So generally they self-pollinate pretty easily. One of the things that makes corn really easy to cross is that you can staple a paper bag over top the tassels to prevent the pollen from landing on the silks. And then you can plant the corn in alternating rows so you can force it to cross. So then you can cross-pollinate the one line onto the next. So really easy to hybridize those things. So monoecious plants have both gender flowers on the same plant. Mono meaning they need one plant. Dioecious, right? So only one type of imperfect flower is on each plant. And so here's a holly. So you have both male and female holly bushes. When you get to gender with plants, especially in the sort of landscape hort world, it's important to understand which one you want for customer satisfaction, right? Typically, they want a holly bush that's got red berries, so it looks pretty at Christmas time. If you sell them a male one, they're going to be frustrated because they'll never have berries. But you still got to get some pollination, right? So you need at least one male for your garden to make sure that they get pollinated. A lot of trees are dioecious, where they have male trees and female trees, staminate on one and pistillate on the others. Cottonwood's an example. So the pistillate tree or the female tree will be the one that produces the cotton. And then the one that's cottonless will be the male. So if you don't want all the mess, you're going to go with the male tree. Other examples, ginkgo or yew. That's this one here. The one that used to dare your friends to eat when you were a kid, thinking you're going to get poisoned. Moving on to flower shapes, types of flower shapes. So regular flowers, that's where the corolla is radially symmetrical, right? So the petals are uniform all the way around. Same size, regular shape. Lots of examples of regular flowers. Irregular flowers typically are bilateral in symmetry, so you can draw a line down the center, and the flower is the same on either side. And typically, one of the petals in the whorl is modified, sort of as a landing strip for pollinators to land on. So they tend to have complicated pollination strategies, and they have very specific insects in mind and things like that. There's some pretty interesting videos on pollinating vanilla orchid vines. You should maybe look those up. You'll have fun reading about or listening. Lots of other irregular flowers out there. Terenia, snapdragon, you name it. Typically adapted to pollinators. And then looking at flowers, there are terms that we use to describe the position of the ovary. This is primarily relevant to when we discuss fruits later in the course, but superior ovaries are above the receptacle and inferior are below the receptacle, basically fused into it completely. And partially inferior, they are half in the receptacle, half out. So there's some terminology there for you to remember. It will make a little more sense when we talk about fruit, but since we're talking about flowers today, we might as well introduce it. So just remember, it's relative, the ovary relative to the receptacle is what we're talking about here in terms of whether it's a superior flower, an inferior flower, or a partially inferior flower. So it's about the receptacle and where the perianth is attached. Looking at inflorescences. So what is an inflorescence? You hear this term sometimes. That's when there's many flowers combined on a single structure. This picture is from the University of Guelph, an initiative to remove giant hogweed from the Grand River area. Giant hogweed is a massive plant that has this sap that gets into your skin and causes sunburn whenever you're exposed to light. It's brutal. It's an invasive plant. Someone probably thought it'd be cool for their garden, and it's huge though, right? So an influence is at the top where the flower is. You can see there's lots of flowers that make up that top part of the plant. Lots and lots of flowers. So we call that collectively, we call that an inflorescence. So there's lots of different kinds of inflorescence. There's solitary, there's spike, there's raceme, there's panicle, there's corymb, umbel, head, and catkin. So starting with solitary, the humble solitary single flower, this pansy is a good example. A spike where there's lots of flowers on a stalk and they have no pedicel, right? The flower is directly on the stalk. Raceme, they're alternating up the center of the stem with increasing or decreasing length pedicels as they mature. So that's a raceme. Lots of examples. This is wisteria, right? So that's upside down. So you could flip the picture, I guess, if you wanted to understand what raceme looked like upside down. Then there's panicle, where there's a lot of branching happening off the stem. So this Bergenia is showing lots of branching coming off into groups and clusters of flowers. So it's an inflorescence, but because it's got this sort of branching, we call it a panicle. Corymb, where there's a central stem and then decreasing length pedicels. This is a status. Pretty cool look. Then there's yarrow, again, similar, decreasing lengths on a central stem. Umbel, things like dill, where the inflorescence all meet to a single point, a central point, is umbel. Think of umbel as short for umbrella. That will help you remember. Compound umbel, so like many umbrellas. Queen Anne's lace here is a classic example of compound umbel. You can see underneath we've got branching and then subsequent more branching into more flowers. So compound umbel. Then there's head, so many flowers attached to a single receptacle. That's a classic head style. Of course, whether it's a osteo or a falmum or a sunflower, they all have these sort of compound head style flowers. Where in fact, what's happening is that there's many hundreds of flowers around the receptacle, and typically they mature slowly from the outers to the center of the flower. If you ever get potted gerbera, you'll notice that the little flowers mature at the outer ring and move more towards the center. By the time it gets to the center, the flower is nearly done. So, as far as wholesalers are concerned, when they're looking at gerberas, for example, they look at how many rings of flowers have opened to determine the age and the shelf life of the gerbera and the quality of it, right? So, and then lastly, there is catkin. Catkin are usually imperfect, right? Incomplete, imperfect, because they are one gender, and they, as such, they cannot be complete because they're missing something, right? So that's Love Lies Bleeding. Such a kind of a tragic name for an amaranth, but anyways, it is actually a pretty cool plant you can grow from seed in your garden pretty easily. Here's some links. Hopefully they still work. I should check that. I did put some fresh links in the extra content folder for this week. Um, you might be able to look at methods of fertilization, pollen tube growth, and that kind of thing. Um, anyways, I hope you enjoy your labs. It's always a lot of fun trying to keep it short so that you can spend lots of time taking apart flowers. Okay, see you next time.